end. Now, in this session, we're going to be talking about, our speakers are going to be addressing the implications of the growth of index funds for corporate governance and for stockholder activism, which in my opinion is a fascinating topic. I mean, do index funds, and we saw a preview of this in the first panel, right? Do index funds offer a way for overcoming the collective action problems that typically have plagued stockholder oversight and offer a way to ameliorate the agency problems that are associated with corporations? Or are they layering a new agency problem on top of the old one, right? So we have a terrific panel to discuss these issues. Kind of nice mix of government, private practice, and academic here. So first up on the government front, we have Cindy Alexander, and Alexander is a senior financial economist at the Office of Asset Management, the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis at the SEC. Prior to that, she was an economist in the Antitrust Division at the DOJ, and has also served on the Council of Economic Advisors. Earned her PhD in economics from UCLA. Has published widely on principal agent problems in economics and finance. So we're delighted to have her with us. After Cindy, we will have Suzanne Hanselman. Hanselman's a partner at Baker Hostetler, a member of the firm's corporate governance and securities practice team. She is an experienced counsel for major companies on a large array of corporate governance and securities law issues, and helps them deal with shareholder proposals as well. She is an adjunct professor at Cleveland Marshall here in Cleveland, and also guest lectures right here at Case Western Law School. So it's good to see her too. Third up will be Jennifer Lewis. Ms. Lewis is counsel at Jones Day and also advises major public companies on aspects of corporate governance, including advising boards on dealing with shareholder activism and related governance matters. And she is a graduate of our humble law school here, Case Western Law School. So welcome back to Jennifer, and thanks for being here. And then last but not least will be our academic, will be David Weber, who you saw a little bit of in the first panel. He is a professor at Boston University School of Law, also teaches occasionally at Harvard Law School, and has published widely on corporate law and corporate governance topics. And not only in academic journals, but also in major popular outlets as well. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here. Again, if you have questions as a non-panelist, as a panelist, feel free to just sort of jump in with questions or send me raise your hand. But if you are in a non-panelist, just put it in the Q&A at any time during the session, and I'll be able to put them to the panel at the end. Okay, so let's start with Cindy Alexander, and I'll send you a little private chat when you've got 10 minutes done, and another after 15 minutes.
Thank you, Charlie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to the organizers to this panel today, Juliet Martin and in this panel. I learned actually quite a lot from the first panel from listening to Anat, Jill, and Darren and Bernie discuss fiduciary duty, and I think you'll see why I found that panel so interesting from this presentation. There is one difference between the perspective I'm going to bring here and what we heard in the first panel, and that's that I will be focusing on the perspective of how did we get to where we are? Have things changed over time from the past to now? And what that means is that I'm going to abstract away from the ideas of how to make things better. And one reason that we do that in analyzing regulation at the SEC is it's always very important for all of these rule ideas to start out with an understanding of what we call the baseline. What is the starting point? And then when we analyze the proposals that people are talking about, usually it's relative to the baseline. So I suggest this is a useful place to start out. I want to focus fairly narrowly on a question, which is has the rise of passive investing changed corporate governance? Actually, that's one question. But when I started looking at how it's changed corporate governance over the past, I realized that there are so many things going on. Let's focus on this one thing I think is a little neglected and is worth considering for a moment. And that is the question of, has the rise of passive investing led to an improvement in corporate governance? And in particular, the more important part is the smaller font in my slide. How could this occur and what are the limitations? So of course, nobody needs to be reminded there's a difference between a natural person and an institution. I'm not the SEC. I'm an economist on the staff at the SEC. So my standard disclaimer applies. The SEC disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement of any employee or commissioner. This presentation expresses the author's views, that would be me, and does not necessarily reflect the views of the commission, the commissioners, or other members of the staff. What am I going to do here? And this is a short presentation. Very simple objective. So the starting point for understanding any effect, when we're talking about, is there an effect of passive investing on corporate governance, is to understand, first of all, what do we mean by passive investing? Second, corporate governance. Here I will explain how I think of it. Then what are the channels for influence going from passive investing to corporate governance? And I'm going to focus on the channel for improvement. I want to understand, what would that look like? How does that operate? And then of course, what are the limitations, which gets us to the glass half empty versus half full type of debate that I think is going on in the literature. And then I will go to questions and research, and I will have some questions about fiduciary duty, and I'm hoping that people from the first panel will be able to join these issues, or else contact me offline afterwards. So when we think about the rise of passive investing, what do we mean, or what do I mean, and what do I think of? I think about how we've observed trends of increased retail investment into index funds over the past decade. That involves substitution out of actively managed mutual funds and into ETFs and index mutual funds primarily. Now, index funds are known as passive funds or passively managed funds, and that has to do with the greater reliance on automation in tracking an index than other funds. And this results in lower costs of asset management. It allows the asset manager to compete profitably for retail money by offering lower fees. So what I observe here when I start thinking about the rise of passive investing are there are two trends, not just one. One is the rise of passive investing, the shift of retail money into index funds. And I think about ETFs and index mutual funds primarily, in the United States at least. And I know there are variations of this in Europe and other places. The other thing I observe is the emergence of large asset management companies onto the landscape. And here I think about this as indicating the presence of scale economies in the management of index funds. So I'm mindful of that there's a change in the organization of these markets at the same time the retail money is moving. Now we get to the second point. What is corporate governance? What do you mean by that? This is review everyone. I could hear from the first panel. This is familiar to everyone, but I think it's always useful in thinking about these things to be mindful of the scope of the system of corporate governance, a fairly broad scope. So corporate governance, I remind ourselves that it's a system that guides the actions of managers and thus the behavior and performance of corporations. It provides a monitoring. We always think of it as monitoring. Monitoring could mean many things, and other solutions to the principal agent problem in the corporation that everyone studies in corporate law. It rests on a foundation with several parts. The part I will focus on right now is the internal governance structure, which includes share ownership and related rights to engage with the management of the company through voting or communications to exercise influence on things like board composition, compensation, and other things. Those things will be a discussion at the end of the day in the last panel, I think. There's also external market competition as another component of corporate governance, part of the system. The managers of the company are sensitive to the labor market pressures on them. There's product market competition that's important that will come up in the next panel on common ownership. We'll skip over that now. And there's also law and regulation that is a source of discipline. We have disclosure regulations, enforcement mechanisms. And then when corporate governance, there are concerns about corporate governance, you'll see major reforms to the law as opposed to waiting for external market competition to create a solution. So I'm going to focus on external governance structure, but also here I want to mention that there may be changes in law and regulation that have caused us to see the results we see today. And I'm looking for any comments that people might have on those that I might be missing that might be important. So when I go back, when I think about, So next I'm going to what is the connection? Passive investing and corporate governance, how are they linked? So we've talked about what is passive investing, what is corporate governance, what's the connection? Well, here I think that it's important to start by distinguishing between two different types of monitoring that outside investors provide. And this joins some of the issues from the first panel. So the rise of passive investing affects corporate governance through its effect on share ownership and related monitoring that they provide. And I distinguish between specific engagement, which involves selecting companies for targeted intervention, and here I call that activism, and general engagement, in which there's monitoring of companies for compliance with norms and standard practices. Here I call that stewardship, to add value. So now we look more closely at each of these in turn. Again, I put this in quotes. This is how I'm thinking of activism. It is a targeted, firm-specific sort of engagement through the exercise of voting rights, and it just takes distinct forms as seen through the lens of the prior literature. One is hedge fund activism that involves proxy contests, 13D filings by holders of 5% or more of stock that are expressly seeking influence. And in filing a 13D form, as we know, there must be an expression of interest in influencing the company. Versus shareholder activism. In that case, we have shareholder proposals that are advisory and submitted by shareholders who have less than 5% of the stock, or passive investors with more than 5% that file a Form 13G. So here I see two different types of activism. I'm looking at through what channel could passive investors exercise influence, or in particular, how could a change, what's the difference in difference? How could a change in passive investing lead to a change in activism? From looking at the literature, it seems that there's evidence of an effect of the hedge fund activism on corporations. It's well documented. That literature focuses on share value, and there's less evidence of an effect of other forms of shareholder activism on corporations, where I'm talking now about having an impact on the principal agent problem of the company that's targeted. And so here I'm going to reach a conclusion that there's limited evidence of an impact from targeted interventions by passive investors into portfolio companies. And so there's a limited potential for a change in passive investing to cause a change in governance through this particular channel as of today. And so because of that, I don't really see how a change over the past in the amount of passive and money in passive investing could have led to a change in governance impact through this channel. Now, here I want to note and flag that this may be changing. We are seeing an emerging literature on how voting is a form of communication among shareholders, so that the votes cast by holders of smaller amounts of stock can provide signals that get picked up by the hedge fund activist channel. And I can see that this is a subject of emerging research. At the same time, as of now, this doesn't seem to be a very fruitful channel to explore if I'm looking for how there could be an improvement or any change actually in the impact of the shareholder channel on governance through the rise of passive investing. So I turn to stewardship. By stewardship, I have in mind that asset managers monitor, generally engage with portfolio companies through their stewardship operations. Why would they do this? Well, there are benefits that accrue to fund shareholders in proportion to their share ownership. so that the fund managers may participate in the gains through fees and repeat dealing or other reputation mechanisms. I'm looking for the incentive here, you can see. And so I think the larger scale fund managers have greater potential gain, from monitoring effort. If I look at the cost to the larger scale fund managers may reflect scale economies in monitoring. The larger asset managers may face a lower cost of monitoring. An additional company or industry, as they add funds, add to their size of their portfolio than other managers or diffuse holders. So with these things in mind, we have the potential for economies of scale in fund stewardship at the management company level, leading to more intensive monitoring of portfolio companies than previously. And this is all reflecting the idea that the monitoring occurs at the management company level, not at the fund level. So the result. Passive investing, this is a proposition and a result coming from the observation that passive investing has led to a change in the structure of equity ownership. More share ownership is under management by large asset management companies and less by smaller managers or diffuse retail investors. That gives us increased scale of asset management companies. We have scale economies in fund stewardship operations, and this gets us greater intensity of monitoring of portfolio companies, with the result being potentially more effective corporate governance. Now for the limitations. Basically, this solution replaces one problem with another. We now have lesser concern about collective action problems of diffuse shareholders in portfolio companies. So we have an improvement from the rise of passive investing relative to where we were before that in the markets. At the same time, as evidenced by the literature that's come up around this phenomenon, we've increased concerns about the quality of the stewardship that asset managers provide as delegated holders of stock, along with questions about the other effects that are going to come up in the next panels. So with this, I'd like to end with some questions for discussion and further study, focusing on the gains that come from stewardship operations of asset managers. We end up with these questions of what's the source of the fund management company incentive to monitor and engage? In particular, fiduciary duty, how is it enforced? Fee-based incentives, how do they affect stewardship operations? And then repeat dealing and reputation, since we know that the management companies are branded, there's a plausible repeat dealing reputational channel here. What is the role and the effect of that channel in this setting? These are my main questions. I have additional questions from the prior panel that come to mind, and that has to do with what is the monitoring technology. I see Bebchuk and Hurst's findings. At the same time, I think that the attention to counting up the number of people assigned to different roles in the asset management company is a first step. And I would like to see a fuller explanation or exploration of how these asset management companies do engage in monitoring is a further exploration of this. And there are also some questions about There are also questions about how closely the monitoring objectives of the asset managers align with the shareholder preferences. And if there's a misalignment, how does the portfolio company adapt? And that goes straight to Bernie Scharfman's question. And I agree with that question. I think it's a very important one. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Again, we're going to hold questions till all four panelists have presented. But if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A at any time. So next up is Suzanne Hanselman. So Suzanne, take it away.
Sure. And I guess, Cindy, are you still sharing your screen? Because it's saying I cannot yet.
She just stopped sharing.
I took it down.
There you go. And Cindy, you can turn off your microphone too. There you go.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for being here. The opportunity to be here today. I've actually learned a lot too. I mean, as has been pointed out, I come from this from a different perspective as a practitioner, dealing with mostly with issuers and companies and how they sort of are focusing all this and how it's modeling their day-to-day behavior. And so I do think it's interesting. There's some different perspectives. Hopefully this won't be too repetitive. I know some of these issues and topics we have covered already this morning, but I kind of wanted to lay the foundation just on these concepts of shareholder activism, the impact on corporate governance, the role of institutional investors. Jennifer, after me, is going to go specifically a little bit more on the influence of the big three and the index funds. And we have talked a little bit already about proxy advisory firms, but also their role in all of this. And I like Cindy's concept of active shareholders versus stewardship. I think sometimes we use the term activist shareholders and maybe something a little bit softer, like highly engaged shareholders. So when we talk about activists, yes, we are usually referring to an individual or a group of individuals who are purchasing shares in the company with the intent of putting pressure on the board and management, basically generally to advance a specific agenda. You know, some of these will go into detail a little bit, but sometimes these range from transactional type financial demands to what most of the focus of today's program on, what I would say, you know, the non-financial demands, corporate governance changes, ESG issues. And so activist shareholders generally will engage with management, but oftentimes are using tactics to garner support from other shareholders. From our perspective, what we're usually monitoring is, you know, Cindy mentioned filing of 13Ds, obviously, then a filing or an amendment to 13D puts everyone on warning that something in this. Generally, though, these outreaches are done typically initially from a letter to the board requesting the did it stop sharing? Can you see that it's sharing? Because it told me it stopped.
No, we can't see it right now. So if you've got slides.
Let me try to do that again. Yeah. I'm not sure why. How about now? Is it back up?
Not seeing anything, no.
All right, well, I apologize. I do not know why, because it says it's here. It's right in front of me. So I don't know if we have a tech person on who can assist with that.
But yeah, I'm Suzanne, I'm on here, but unfortunately I can't see what you're seeing.
Once you, well, I'm seeing my slideshow.
Once you pick your slides, click share. It's a blue button in the bottom right-hand side of that screen that should show all of the different slides.
Yeah, I'm on a different, sorry.
Go to share screen at the bottom, which is in green. Pick the slides that you want to share, highlight that. And then in that window, there should be a blue button at the bottom that says share.
Which is what I'm not seeing that. So
you clicked on the red or green share screen button.
Yes, I did that.
And what comes up?
When I do that, I can see my presentation.
Okay, there should be a step in between that where you choose that presentation.
No, I'm saying it gave me the opportunity to choose that presentation, and that's what I'm showing as being.
Okay, and then.
And so what I'm saying is I'm seeing.
Okay, we're seeing it now.
Now we're seeing it.
So if it flies off again, let me know. Sorry about that.
Will do.
Anyway, so initially this does start with contact directly with the company, oftentimes requesting the opportunity to meet with management. more increasingly to meet with members of the board, specifically the independent members of the board. When we talk about, as Cindy said, more of the, what we'd say, highly engaged or the stewardship investors, that's really the use of Rule 14A8, which I'll talk about. There's also the opportunity to conduct vote no's or withhold campaigns, because obviously if you want to put, I can tell you from working with boards, if you want to put pressure on a board, you know, companies do publicly disclose the support that board members get as a result of elections, and board members are very sensitive to having, you know, a less than substantial support. Also rising, and this is interesting, I think, because the SEC, we're going to talk a little bit about Rule 14A8. It's already been discussed, but some of the changes. But the SEC even did in that comment on the other methods for shareholder communications these days with social media, other platforms. And so, you know, looking at the rules that are right now sort of regulating shareholder communications. On the more activist side, and this is when, you know, probably what we oftentimes, I mean, from a company's perspective, the sort of extreme is the actual engage of a proxy contest for representation on the board. You know, generally those oftentimes these days just, and a lot of these initiatives really do end up in a negotiation. And in fact, you know, this past proxy season, of the 4 companies I was working with that all had a threatened proxy contest, all 4 ended up negotiating with the proponent to basically put representation on the board. And then, so I did want to talk, so shareholder proposals, because that's where a lot of these initiatives begin. And as has been discussed, shareholder proposals is the SEC rule that basically allows a shareholder to include a proposal or resolution in the company's proxy statement to then put it in front of all shareholders. And obviously that's an effective tool because it is the ability to influence management without significant cost to the proponent. The way 14A8 works, I mean, there are a lot of potential challenges for including a proposal. The SEC limits the topics that are proper for a proposal. There's some procedural requirements that recently have been amended. We'll talk about that. Most importantly, the resolutions are always framed as precatory or non-binding. You know, for example, we recommend that the board adopt a policy on board diversity, et cetera. So not really necessarily making a binding action. And as you're probably all familiar, there is the possibility of a company to seek no action position from the SEC if they believe they have proper reasons for excluding a shareholder proposal. And I can tell you from the practitioner standpoint, and Jennifer probably spends a great amount of time on her dealing with this too, beginning about this time of year, because a lot of times this is when deadlines for shareholder proposals for the next proxy season start hitting. You know, this takes up a significant amount of time and the attention of companies and their management and counsel. There has been criticism in recent years that because some of the thresholds for putting shareholder proposals forward weren't amended for I think 20 years, that really the balance between you know, the balance of interests had kind of been shifted. The SEC, and it's just discussed, and it will be, I think it will be interesting how this impacts the number of shareholder proposals that are received, because currently the requirement is that a shareholder have at least $2,000 or 1% of the company's securities for a 1-year period for eligibility. And as you can see, the SEC in the amended rule came back with a tiered approach that's based on the significance of the holdings balanced with the length of holding. So that 2,000 threshold is still the minimum threshold, but a shareholder would have to hold those shares for at least 3 years. And then as you can see, it just tiers. This also, I think, was alluded to. Shareholders can't aggregate their holdings with those of other shareholders to satisfy these new ownership thresholds. And there've also been some amendments to how frequently a proposal can be put on the proxy statement. For example, if it doesn't gain enough support in 1 year, that shareholder may have to back off by putting that proposal on in the next year until it satisfies, garners certain levels of support. So some have seen these as significantly restricting the voice of minority shareholders. I think, like I said, we'll see these. It'll be a while. The amended rules don't apply to this coming proxy season, and so. And then there is a phase in of the ownership rules. So we may not see the full impact for a couple years. These are the types of agenda items that are usually brought forward by activist shareholders to affect change. You know, as I said earlier, kind of the ones on, I would say, the merger, the transactional, the financial, strategy, operational. Those usually are dealt with by the activists that are really coming in and looking to try to make oftentimes like a short-term change. For example, trying to get the company to declare a dividend, look at what it's using its cash flow for, maybe trying to spin off a significant, an underperforming segment of the business. That's not really what we're focusing on here. It really is sort of this bottom quadrant, corporate governance issues. And, so this is just kind of some statistics. It's interesting, 2020 was a little bit down as far as shareholder proposals and activist targets. I don't really know, I don't really think, at least for shareholder proposals, we can blame the COVID on that, because most of those, as I said, most of those proposals are due, in the fall. We'll see what happens this year. I mean, I do know, like, for example, so the proxy season hit just as a lot of the government shutdowns hit. That did impact a lot of the work in this area. I think some shareholders were pretty understanding of management's having to sort of focus on different issues right now. And at least in my experience, we're willing to kind of back off on some initiatives. Some companies ended up having to postpone meetings. So this year was a little bit just sort of disrupted, and we're waiting to see what comes in. A lot of times these initiatives, as I've said, end up in kind of a negotiated settlement. So it does end up in the shareholder proponents usually getting what they set out to achieve. But, one of the downsides is that a lot of times that's done, without any sort of public disclosure of it, and without the ability of other shareholders to sort of weigh in on that. When we talk about how the proposals have impacted governance, I've been practicing 30 years now, and I think a lot of these initiatives, it is kind of interesting how they come into play. I mean, usually it starts with targeting large cap companies and S&P 500s. I think, these corporate watchdogs and some of the more, what we call the stewardship, have really pushed best practices for companies. And, eventually, I think one of the most significant things is clients that, and you can see this when they, clients that get selected to be in the S&P 500, and how that almost immediately dramatically certainly raises their profile and makes, I think some companies have been caught off guard on the significance that means and how much attention they now have to pay to these issues. Some of these proposals eventually become subject to regulation. I think there was a time that, say, on pay, where shareholders had a chance to weigh in on executive compensation. There were a lot of shareholder proposals that now is required SEC disclosure. On the opposite side of that, there was SEC regulation on proxy access, rules that it would allow, similar to being able to put a proposal in the company's proxy statement, the ability for shareholders to actually put their own director nominees in the company's proxy statement. That rule was vacated by court action, but proxy access is pretty much the standard now in the S&P 500, and that is as a result of shareholder proposals that oftentimes pretty much adopted just what the SEC had put forth. And then there's oftentimes, some of these governance issues, I think, become so widely accepted and adapted that companies they just are, at least the clients I work with, they're just adapting some of these before they even get any kind of proposal on it, just because they realize that it's going to eventually, they will get a proposal and they are more inclined to just adapt it. For example, majority vote for the election of directors. So this is from ISS, these, if you look at the last, 20 years, these are kind of the governance proposals. As I've said, for S&P 500 and large cap companies, most of these are in place now. And what we've really seen since then is sort of the move towards ESG issues, which I know is going to be a topic for a later panel. But just kind of initially what we're seeing, I think this is an area where at least from my perspective, companies aren't as willing to put this fight in front of the shareholder base and are much more inclined to work with investors on these issues. And we are seeing the result of that, a lot of increased disclosure, voluntary disclosure on some of these issues, looking at their board diversity. I do think this has clearly impacted, at least from my experience, how boards are operating. I think in the last several years have made more of an effort to be in front of these issues and not reacting, being a little bit more having some idea of what they're doing before shareholders even approach. And I think a lot of the diversity, we talked about board diversity. From a corporate perspective, it is something that they are looking at. Most companies now do have some type, they haven't not necessarily adopted like a Rooney Rule, but they are looking. One thing is, and I know there's organizations that help with this, is just, it's interesting because the other things that institutional investors and proxy advisors are concerned with is board overboarding, where a board director serves on too many boards. And we're actually finding this to be an issue with diverse candidates because they're so high, they're in such high demand to serve on boards. This just sort of covers what we talked about, how a lot of these are not going really into, there might be, the shareholder proposals on these issues haven't gained a lot of support yet, but even without majority support, they still are having an influence because, as I said, companies, have been willing to try to implement policies, do some voluntary reporting, whether it's carbon gas emissions or I think the areas where they're a little less willing right now and might need some push are on some of the sort of the internal pay ratio issues. For example, pay ratio among men and women or other diverse candidates. Institutional investors, which we've been talking about, they are willing to engage. This is when we talk, when we've been talking about fiduciary duties and really the sort of the, sometimes maybe the disconnect on the economic performance of a fund, the corporate governance. Sometimes it's even difficult. Like I've seen this with clients who are trying to talk to institutional investors on their stance on positions. The fund managers are thrilled with the company's performance and really have no issues. But then the other side of the fund, kind of the voting side, the governance side, maybe. So, even when we're dealing with funds, we've got some issues just internally, which I know we've sort of spoken about a little bit. We talked about ISS, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time other than that they do influence, corporate governance because of their role providing research and reports to their clients on these issues. I think there has been new SEC rules that have tried to call for a little bit more transparency in how they develop their voting guidelines, the conflicts of interest that they may have. Some say it didn't go far enough. Some have said it's, we'll see how that plays out. The other advisory firms, Glass Lewis, Egan Jones, certainly don't have the same amount of influence as ISS, but are also involved. So I know that's my time, and I will let Jennifer take it over and talk a little bit more specifically about institutional investors and index funds.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. So yes, next up, Ms. Lewis. You've got, I'll give you a chat notification in 10 minutes and then again at 15 minutes that you've got a few minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
We can see you've started sharing, but we can't yet see the slides.
Okay, I did share it.
There it is. We can see it now.
Okay. Okay, good. Now I've lost my screen to see anybody else, so I'm just going to talk. Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne, for leading into some of these topics I'd like to get into. I'd like to spend the next segment discussing the ways that the big three investors affect corporate governance, particularly through their engagement efforts, by developing their voting policies and by voting their proxies, particularly on director elections and on shareholder proposals. Okay, so let's start with a quick overview of some of these governance issues. I know several of these have been talked about, but they're critical in understanding some of the policies and voting results I want to talk about later. This slide gives a list of corporate governance hot topics focusing on board issues and on shareholder rights. These are a few of the board provisions. The first row talks about board classification, staggered boards. This has been mentioned. Basically, in a staggered board, only the directors serve staggered 3-year terms, so only a third of the directors stand for election in any given year. This is basically a defense against proxy contests because an insurgent shareholder could not gain majority control of the board in a single election. If a board is not classified, that means every director is up for election annually. Next up, board leadership really focuses on the role of the board chair and whether the board chair is the CEO or an independent director. I should be mentioning trends as I go along here. The trend on board classification is a very strong movement toward annual elections. The trends on board leadership, that's moved a little more slowly. The trend is towards splitting the chair and CEO role, but currently 47% of S&P 500 companies, the CEO serves as the board chair, and only a third of S&P 500 companies have a truly independent board chair. Overboarding was already mentioned. That's whether directors serve on an excessive number of boards. Whether the number is excessive depends on whom you ask. This one I think is particularly interesting because looking at the policies of the proxy advisors and then the big three index funds, Vanguard's policy on overboarding is actually the most strict, stricter even than ISS, which came as a surprise to many of my clients when Vanguard created that policy, that they would actually be stricter than ISS in that regard. We've talked about director election standards. The traditional director election standard was a plurality vote, where basically the nominees with the greatest number of votes were elected. That has changed overwhelmingly in favor of majority voting standards, where a director candidate would need a majority of the votes cast in his or her election to be elected. The next two, obviously voting for directors is a fundamental right of shareholders. The next two talk also about shareholder rights, the right to call a special meeting and the right to act by written consent. The traditional positions were to prohibit stockholders from acting in these manners. The trend has been to be more permissive with these rights, particularly with special meetings, less so with written consents. Last up, I have supermajority votes to amend the bylaws or charter. And the trend here has been moving away from supermajority voting provisions towards a majority vote. This slide gives a snapshot, the incidence of these governance provisions among various indices. You should note that I've framed the first column here on the left in terms of the traditional governance provisions. So I'm talking about classified boards rather than annual elections. That means for the data, the smaller the number, that means the smaller the number of companies that have retained the traditional position and the more companies that have moved towards the more shareholder-friendly options. So for classified boards, currently 10.7% of S&P 500 companies have retained a classified board. Back in 2005 or 2006, that number was 60%. So you can see how much that's fallen off, largely as a result of shareholder activism, particularly by institutional shareholders, and voting on those on shareholder proposals, including by the big three. As you can see, there's a disparity here with smaller companies. Nearly half of Russell 2000 companies have held on to their classified boards. And you'll see that disparity really throughout the slide as we look at these other rights. For example, the voting standards to elect directors, only 9.6% of the S&P 500 have held on to the plurality voting standard. That means more than 90% have moved to majority voting. But if you look at the Russell 2000, only about a third of them have moved to majority voting. You'll see here there's a movement for special meetings and written consents, less so again with written consents. And the smaller companies have been slower to move on that. Now let's touch on some of the influences on corporate governance. Obviously, state and federal law and regulations and stock exchange listing requirements have a big impact on corporate governance. The board of directors and management obviously have a direct hand in it, and as do shareholders, including institutional investors and the big three. The others I have on here are analysts, media, governance experts, proxy advisors, and peer companies. Clearly, there are other forces at work here. One I found interesting is that Goldman Sachs now has a policy that it won't take companies public unless they have a certain number of female directors on the board. I believe it's 1 for 2020 and 2 for 2021. So that's just kind of an interesting side note on who's getting involved with corporate governance. We've talked about proxy advisors and their role here. There are still many institutional investors that rely heavily on proxy advisors, voting policies, and their recommendations to vote their shares. However, institutional investors, particularly the larger ones, have mostly established their own in-house governance policies and voting policies and in-house stewardship teams to handle these items. Here's a description of State Street's stewardship team. And they note here that their voting and engagement activities are centralized within their stewardship team, irrespective of investment strategy or geographic region. Consolidating our voting decisions and engagement efforts in this way enables us to leverage the full power of our institutional discretionary holdings and exert greater influence with management and boards. So these stewardship teams are really at the core of each of the big three, and they wield an enormous amount of power. They're generally overseen by investment committees, but these stewardship teams in some cases really affect the voting decisions of a fund's portfolio companies across the globe. Here's a list of some ways that institutional investors can affect corporate governance. We've talked about most of these, I think: stewardship priorities and published reports, voting policies, engagement, letters to CEOs, particularly BlackRock CEO and Chair Larry Fink's January letter to corporate America that, to me, often serves as kind of a bellwether as of what to expect during the proxy season. Proxy voting as well for the big three. The highlighted and bolded ones are really ones that the big three participate in. As you see here, they generally don't do the letter writing campaigns that some institutions do. They generally do not submit shareholder proposals, although they do, of course, vote on them. And they generally don't launch activist campaigns or proxy contests. Now, digging into the big three as influencers, this data I found very interesting. This gives a snapshot of the big three's ownership of S&P 250 companies as of early 2020. These first two columns are showing the percentage of outstanding shares owned. So the big three combined own an average percentage of about 20% in S&P 250 companies. Their voting power is somewhat higher. This is because the big three funds generally vote all of their shares at every meetings, while other stockholders do not. So the voting power of the big three is intensified. And this data is showing that Vanguard has 10.6% average vote, BlackRock with 9%, State Street with 5.4%, for a combined total of 25% as the mean percentage of votes cast at S&P 500 companies. And that's just an incredible number. That's an incredible amount of power. It's incredible even when you just look at the segments. But 25% of S&P 500 companies is an enormous amount of voting power. Now, I'd like to dive in a little bit to the evolution of shareholder engagement and how it's changed in recent years. Traditionally, shareholder engagement was a one-way and rather limited effort. Companies would generally reach out to their largest institutional shareholders when they needed them to vote on a particular issue on the annual meeting ballot or in special circumstances, such as a business transaction involving the company. And the engagement was generally focused just on the proposals on which they needed to vote. Often the engagement wasn't even made directly by the company. Instead, the company's proxy solicitor would reach out on its behalf to solicit support for the proposals, usually by mail or telephone. Current shareholder engagement practices are markedly different. It's really a completely different world. Now investors often initiate the engagement with the companies in which they invest. This includes investors of all sizes, from retail investors to the big three. Engagement also now focuses on a wide variety of topics, including things like strategy and risk management, not just the limited topics on the shareholder ballot, and it's a year-round effort. Companies are more than ever directly involved in the engagement, including not only key management personnel, but also independent directors. And there have been many factors that have contributed to the shift in shareholder engagement practices, but the concentration of ownership in passive and index funds is a critical factor here. And in fact, in the past several years, many public companies have taken active to proactively engage with the big three and other index funds, sometimes even doing kind of a fall roadshow to go make presentations about not only the company's performance, but also long-term strategic initiatives and corporate governance and risk management. And again, shareholder engagement is no longer limited to topics on the annual meeting ballot. In fact, it can touch on a wide variety of issues. This is the list that State Street had in its latest stewardship report. And as you can see, they engage on topics ranging from board composition and effectiveness to strategic matters, environmental issues, and then a broad range of social issues. How do they choose their targets? This again is from State Street, saying that they identify companies based on various financial and ESG indicators, including size of their holdings. They say they target companies with poor long-term financial performance within their sector. And they also target companies that are identified as lagging standards, particularly on ESG matters. Also those with outstanding leftover concerns from a prior engagement. Now let's take a quick look at the engagement activities from 2020 of the big three more closely. I'm focused on the data on the left-hand side of these slides. Vanguard reported that it engaged with 793 companies worldwide in 2020. 517 of those were US companies, which represented about 61% of Vanguard's assets under management in the US. Vanguard stated it was focusing on climate-related proposals and diversity and issues, including both board and workforce diversity and political spending and lobbying proposals. BlackRock, with more than 3,000 engagements globally, about half of those in the US, again, representing 61% of its assets under management, highlights again, the climate theme was a theme for all three of the big three in 2020. And BlackRock also was focused on human capital management issues, including diversity, disclosure on human rights issues, and issues in the supply chain. State Street did not have its full 2020 results out yet. So these numbers in the margin that's the number of meetings on which State Street voted globally in 2020, with 3,500 in the US. Again, the themes of climate change and diversity were issues for State Street. I want to touch on some of the big three voting policies. And just to give some context, this slide shows the matters that typically would appear on a company's annual meeting ballot. The election of directors, the annual advisory vote on executive compensation, ratification of auditors, any management proposals, and then shareholder proposals. These first four are generally seen as routine matters, but shareholder proposals are really a different breed. Primarily, of course, because they are proposals brought by shareholders, where the rest of these are presented by the board and management. But shareholder proposals also touch on a variety of and wide variety of themes. I've broken them here into kind of ESG components. But a lot of these are very divisive issues, quasi-political issues. Many companies have been faced for many years with governance proposals, but E&S proposals are certainly on the rise. When we're talking about voting policies of the big three on shareholder proposals, first focusing on governance proposals, the big three, like the proxy advisors, often have specific voting policies on these governance items, talking about board composition, powers of the board, shareholder rights, proxy access, things like that. Whether a particular big three fund will support a governance shareholder proposal may hinge on steps that the company's already taken to address the matter. For example, if a company is faced with a proposal to permit shareholders to act by written consent, it's possible that an institutional investor may decide to vote against that if the company has already permitted shareholders to call special meetings and act outside the annual meeting process in that manner. Similarly, if there's a proposal to requesting that the company have an independent board chair, institutions may decide, to vote case by case and may vote against it if the company has a CEO serving as the board chair, but has also has an independent lead director who has sufficient responsibility and authority to satisfy the investor. So many of these policies are done on a case-by-case basis, which is a good thing. I don't feel that governance or these governance policies are a one-size-fits-all endeavor, and having investors vote case-by-case on shareholder proposals that may push them as such, I think is helpful to companies. So there are a few absolutes here. But I did manage to find some for you. ISS was kind enough to run the voting records of each of the big three funds for me on a global basis, all of their funds, all of the meetings at which they voted. And I discovered that each big three fund and each fund in the fund families voted all of its shares at every company, at every meeting across the globe in support of shareholder proposals to declassify the board. So that is a governance absolute. I can tell you that the big three do not like classified boards, and I'm sure that comes as a surprise to basically no one. I noticed that State Street also showed that it voted 100% of its shares on majority voting proposals and also proposals to eliminate supermajority voting provisions.
Jennifer, I hate to interrupt. We still have one more panelist left, so if you could try to wrap it up in the next minute or two, that would be terrific.
Absolutely. Let me jump to this slide here then. As it was mentioned, many of these shareholder proposals are precatory. They merely request that the board take action. So you may ask, why do these shareholder proposals, why are they so influential in changing corporate behavior? And the reason here is that many investors in the proxy advisory firms have linked those the successes of the shareholder proposals to their votes on directors. So if a shareholder proposal receives majority support and the board does not take responsive action, then many of these voting policies say that at the next annual meeting, the funds will vote against director nominees. And if you're thinking in terms of carrots and sticks, this is a very big stick. As noted, directors don't stand for election, so they can be voted down. Directors and companies hate to see a high number of against votes against directors. This turns into a little bit of a loop here. If the directors have a high withhold vote and the issues underlying that are not addressed, then at the next annual meeting, you'll again have votes against directors. So it's really a cycle that the company can fall into if they don't break it. Now, keeping in mind that the 25% voting strength of these three funds combined, I just want to talk about a couple proposals here that did not pass on an average basis in 2020. This is based on Georgeson data. You'll see that some of these are within 25 percentage points of a majority vote. And I'll just flip through these last slides to show you that the big three have voting power that they are not using to push these proposals. So it may be if the big three decide to back these proposals, or perhaps if the proposals change in a way that the big three finds that they would support these, more of these shareholder proposals would pass. These are independent board chair proposals. You can see that BlackRock voted against almost 98% of those proposals. Board diversity proposals, even though these funds have voting policies relating to this, they still have high votes against many of the proposals that go to a shareholder vote. Same for some of these governance issues. Same for these climate reports as well. These, while all of the funds voted 100% of their shares in favor of companies publishing sustainability reports, the votes are much smaller for climate change reporting. And we expect that to increase, and it's possible that it might be changes in the proposal to make them less prescriptive and give management more discretion. They may pass with more solid margins. And that's all I had.
Thank you very much. That's really great data. So I'm excited to see that. Thank you. All right, so we have one more panelist, and that's David Weber. So David, please take 15 to 18 minutes, and then we'll still have 10 minutes or so for some questions as well at the end.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about a paper you already heard a little bit about this morning in Bernie Scharfman's presentation. I'll get into it a little bit more detail. So this is co-authored work with Quinn Curtis and Michal Barzuza, both of the University of Virginia Law School. And our paper is called Shareholder Values, Index Fund, ESG Activism, and the New Millennial Corporate Governance. And what we set out to do in this paper was try to explain what increasingly was looking like, the puzzle of this kind of new activism that we're seeing by the big three and other funds in the ESG space. If you and to cut right to the chase here, we think that one possible explanation for a lot of the relatively new ESG activism that we are seeing by the big three is really about a war over being able to manage future and present, and particularly future millennial wealth. And we think that that effort to attract millennial wealth is at least partly what may explain some of this relatively new ESG activism that we have been seeing from the big three. So if you look at the literature on mutual funds as shareholders, for much of their history and even right up till the present, much of the literature describes them as basically passive, particularly index funds. And I'm not just talking about the passive active management distinction. I'm talking about the fact that they historically have not filed shareholder proposals. They historically have not been particularly confrontational with management. And there's a lot of reasons why the literature has identified that mutual funds have long been passive in that respect. For example, if one contrasts the large mutual funds with other diversified investors like public pension funds or labor union funds, these other funds have been very active filers of shareholder proposals. They pushed in Dodd-Frank for votes on CEO pay, CEO to worker pay ratio. They were at the forefront of shareholder proposals about majority voting and proxy access and so forth. And yes, while some of the mutual funds voted in support of that, they were not exactly on the front lines of those fights and have historically remained relatively passive on them. And part of the traditional explanation for that, there's a number of potential explanations, but part of the explanation has also been fear of managerial retaliation, right? So what do the big three do? A lot of their business is managing the 401ks and the retirement plans of people who often work at big publicly held companies. And so the traditional view, at least one traditional view, has been that mutual funds have been reluctant to really exercise their shareholder rights, their shareholder power, either as voters, certainly also in the litigation space. They have typically been much more passive in terms of litigation around, say, M&A issues or 10b5 securities fraud, et cetera. In part for fear that it's not a great business model to be aggressively going after CEO pay or challenging them with shareholder proposals or bringing lawsuits against them when you're simultaneously trying to win their 401k business. So that's been the usual story. And yet we have seen a departure from the usual story on some of these ESG fronts in recent years. We saw State Street very famously sponsoring the Fearless Girl statue on Wall Street to confront the traditional Wall Street bull, and coinciding with announcement of both the She Index Fund and their new shareholder voting proposal, where they were going to be targeting boards that did not have any women on them, right? And we have seen that they escalate. So after State Street announced that its policy that it would be targeting voting against nominating committee chairs of corporate boards that had no women on them, BlackRock came out and announced they were going to do the same for boards that didn't have 2 women on them, right? So we've seen this kind of escalation of this ESG behavior. And so ultimately, we were trying to kind of puzzle this out a little bit. And there are definitely alternative explanations out there as well. Maybe we'll be hearing, I know Ed Rock has written about this, Jeff Gordon, Madison Condon, my colleague, who's presenting later this afternoon, right, about explanations for this new rise in ESG activism. Also, I mentioned the diversity component. We've also seen it on environmental issues, voting in favor of environmental proposals, on global warming disclosure proposals, and actually making it a significant part of their marketing campaigns and so forth. So what's driving it? Well, here's what we don't think is driving it. Okay, we don't think, when you look at index funds, they're all invested in the same thing. So they can't outperform each other on returns. We know that their costs, competing on cost, has almost been whittled down to a number approaching 0, and in some cases is in fact 0. What's left to compete on is assets under management, and they can compete with each other via over assets under management by trying to win that next generation of investment. So why millennials? Why do we think it's really being driven by millennials? We took a close look at this and we noticed a couple of things that are going on here. First of all, a lot of the social science research in this space shows that millennials really are different from both Generation X and baby boomers on a number of dimensions. First of all, it turns out that on many political and social issues, they are significantly to the left of previous generations. Socialism is less of a bad word. We are not claiming that that millennials are socialist, although millennial voters did back Bernie Sanders pretty big time in the Democratic primaries. But it's not just a question of the substantive attitudes that differ about global warming, about diversity, but another significant difference in how millennials approach the world versus Gen X and the baby boomers is that they are much more likely to take their politics with them to work, to take it into the investment space, to have it affect their behavior as consumers. Both survey research and behavioral research seems to backs the claim that they are much more supportive of the idea that you take your politics into the workplace, you take it into where you shop and what you buy, and the same seems to be true for investments, right? And so we have attitudinal differences from previous generations. And we also observe that the funds themselves are aware of this, right? So Larry Fink, we've already heard multiple times about Larry Fink's letter. Fink has pointed out that the millennials stand to inherit $24 trillion. It's the largest intergenerational asset transfer in the history of the world. That memo after memo, that it is clear that these investment managers are seeing, it emphasizes time and again that millennials care about these issues, and we observe it in the world. We observe it in episode after episode, right? We saw it at Papa John's after the CEO uttered a slur publicly and made certain other controversial comments that consumption of Papa John's pizza plummeted and market value followed along with it. We've seen it recently in episodes like at Equinox, where the company held a fundraiser for Trump, and we saw this campaign go viral on Instagram of people canceling their membership at Equinox and then posting a photo of their canceling that and putting it up on Instagram. We have seen this activism in the workplace with the Wayfair walkout, where after the company had sold some equipment to be used in one of the detention centers at the border, there was a significant worker walkout. We have seen it. So we've seen it in the employment space as well, in addition to the consumer space. And we think we're also seeing it in the investment space, right? Millennials are much more willing to say that they want to work for companies and invest in companies that have a social good, a social purpose, and aren't just about maximizing returns. So when we add all this up, what is it that we observe and what is it that we take away? First of all, in this space, as I started out saying, these funds are not docile, but have been active. For example, they voted hundreds of times against directors in uncontested elections on the question of gender diversity, over 400 times in the first year by State Street. And we saw significant uptick in women on corporate boards. We heard earlier today about Goldman Sachs's new policy. Even recently, and I know this strays beyond index funds, but just 2 weeks ago, the Business Roundtable came out with a statement about Black Lives Matter and systemic racism and what they planned to do to deal with that. We think that this also reflects this kind of new urgency and millennial pressure on the corporate side and not just on the investment side. So the four takeaways we have are, we are seeing activism in this particular space. They're not the usual passive role here. We see that they escalate on these ESG issues and not just, they're doing more, they're out ahead of, let's say, ISS, they're out ahead of what other investors are doing. And we think ultimately that while they still do fear managerial retaliation, it's still a factor. The reality is the managers are now under precisely the same pressures, and they really fear this loss of millennial dollars even more. Some of the examples that I brought up about, say Equinox and Papa John's and others, some of those examples show the real risk in this era of cancel culture, that if you make the wrong move and you come out the wrong way on these issues, very quickly there could be bottom line harm to the company, right? We saw something like this, by the way, this summer. Yet another example was what happened with Starbucks after the company, when employees started wearing Black Lives Matter pins to the store. And then the company announced that those pins were out of bounds and that nobody could wear pins with political messages on them. There was a huge outcry from their own employees about this, who are, by the way, younger workers are critical to Starbucks's business model. They've been offering, for example, college tuition benefits for years, right? And the company not only reversed itself, but bought 250,000 Black Lives Matter t-shirts and distributed them to workers, right? So these pressures are very real. And we think that that's what they're responding to and what the index funds are paying a lot of attention to in trying to recruit millennial investors. Finally, I think another important takeaway of our paper has to do with the increasingly prevalent idea that that shareholder preferences aren't just about returns necessarily, or that they take these other considerations into account. And in a way, so there's a couple different ways to think about this last piece of it. One is that some shareholders are willing to trade off returns in exchange for some other benefit. That's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it actually is that these are increasingly converging with each other. That is to say that because of the millennial feedback loop, because millennials will act on these issues as consumers, because they will act on them in the workplace as employees, it will have and does have feedback effects into the corporate bottom line, and therefore into share prices. So in a way, trying to put these things all into separate boxes and analyze them and think of them as a series of trade-offs is at best complicated and maybe actively misleading because of these kind of feedback effects. I think I'll stop there. I know that we have the Q&A for all four of us at the end of this panel, but the short takeaway is we think that a lot of this activism that we have seen, this renewed activism, or really new activism, and more aggressive activism on the index side is a result of this battle for millennial investment dollars.
Thank you, David, for that presentation. Again, I wish we had longer here because I have a million questions about this this topic, but we don't have a ton of time. But we do have a question from Cindy Alexander, actually one of our panelists first. So Cindy, why don't you go ahead and ask?
You're muted, Cindy.
Unmute. Thank you for these interesting presentations. David, you answered my question in the last few minutes, and but I'll chat later because I'm really interested in your findings. And I want to know how this moves to the bottom line, because I'm trying to sort these forms of engagement into which ones join the issue of share value, and how do those channels work? As you could see from my presentation, it seems to be a puzzle, and I think it's an interesting one. For Jennifer, my question that I have that you might be able to answer is, you were pointing to the different forms of engagement by the big three, which I guess that's what you call it, big three. Anyway, so these large asset management companies. And my question is, I'm trying to reconcile what I heard in your presentation from what I'm seeing coming from Bebchuk and Hurst and others. And so one question for you is, where do these guys get their information when they're choosing how to engage?
I'm sorry, where do they get their information on the targets?
Yeah, so for example, one might think that if you started thinking about engagement by an asset management company with a portfolio company, one might start out thinking, well, they just randomly choose the name of a company and then start talking to them through some communication. And through the communication, they form a view about how to try to influence the portfolio company. Now, I think that's not quite right. For example, you look like you got a lot of information without talking to the companies and collected it all by yourself. So I'd like to know if you have any thoughts on how these, like the BlackRock, State Street, where do they get the information that they use in deciding like how to vote and what policies to set?
Well, I think a lot of it increasingly depends on the disclosures that these companies are making around their governance practices and around their E&S initiatives. And that's why disclosure is becoming such a hot point on those topics. Certainly these funds have the influence to meet with these companies directly. But I do think a lot of it, they have kind of gleaned this information from a number of years and have seen where companies have, made what they would consider progress on the issue and those that are lagging. There are certainly some of them that have sort of, worked in kind of governance rating systems within their own organizations to target the companies that are important for the priorities that they've set.
And I think in addition to that, in some instances, it's the company making the first reach out or engagement with the funds, because that's just now a part of kind of their regular communications, looking at their top investors and trying to engage with them all year long.
So the information flow is going, the initiative is from the portfolio company, you think, in some cases?
Some case, I mean, Jennifer, yeah, in some cases it absolutely is.
Definitely, yes.
And Cindy, you also have to keep in mind, it's not bilateral, right? There are all sorts of institutional investor organizations. There are all sorts of groups that involve issuers and institutional investors. There are governance organizations. So there are lots of ways. And the big mutual fund companies have representatives, have participants in all those organizations.
So actually, some of us were looking at the recent literature, and it caught my eye that in the academic literature, we're still learning how to measure this stuff. And so, for example, I was wondering to what extent you could use information about the name of somebody who's filing a lawsuit or filed a comment as an indicator of whether that party, whether that, as a measure of whether that party is the only one doing the engagement, for example. And it sounds like from what you're saying, Jill, that may not be the case.
I think it's definitely not the case. And, Lucian and Scott are using a very limited set of variables to measure engagement that, are sort of at a distance from a lot of what's going on in the market.
Right, which begs the question of what additional variables could one look at? And I wonder if anyone has, Jill, maybe you have suggestions or others do. Because I do hear that there, in one of the presentations, there's a lot of hidden communication that goes on. So I think that came up in Suzanne, your presentation, that there's a lot of behind the scenes discussion. I know that there is behind the scenes discussion from my own research in proxy contests, but what I heard from you is that this also goes on in the shareholder proposal channel.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the company might receive a shareholder proposal and, talk with an investor and have it withdrawn. Or even more commonly, might just receive a letter regarding a certain governance practice or policy with maybe the threat of, if not getting the company engaged, it'll follow up with a shareholder proposal. And other than perhaps saying when the company's adopting something that, they discussed it with their shareholders, it wouldn't necessarily ever be publicly disclosed.
Cindy, if I could just add something, one of the things we talk about in the paper is these withhold votes in uncontested director elections that we've seen the big three do. And there has been research on that shows that I could forward you the paper. There's been research on that shows that can affect what they do, let's say with compensation of that director next time. But I don't think there's anything, if one of my colleagues can tell me I'm wrong if I am, I don't think there's anything that looks at that issue in terms of shareholder returns and Tobin's Q and things, those, more, those types of
piece. Okay, so the truth is that when so I work with financial economists quite a lot. And so I come to this from that side. And I do see there's an echo going back and forth between the legal scholarship and the financial economics literature. And maybe the echoes on the financial economics side in any event. Usually if I'm trying to look at and understand whether there's an impact on share value, and I want something somewhat dispositive, I'll try to find something. I won't look for shareholder proposals because that's a really weak signal. And I'm not saying I think there's absolutely no effect.
Sir, I just have to jump in because there's a paper, it's unpublished, so I just don't know, I'm not in a position to evaluate it, but I think it's fascinating. It finds that when it's a close call vote, as in, it basically shows that the big three are, anyone can really tell what are the close call votes. The big three seem to devote more attention to the close call votes. When they vote in favor of the close call votes, it contributes to shareholder value. And it's really an effect that's coming just from the big three and not from the other index funds.
That's interesting.
And also because there's a lot of speculation, I know Joshua was going to talk about this. There's a lot of speculation the big three get their information from their active share, the active funds that they hold, that those do the real research and pass it on to the passive funds. She finds that this effect holds even when you take the votes where the big three don't have a presence, when there isn't an active channel.
These are shareholder proposals?
I think it's just votes generally.
Okay. And that's okay. Yeah,
We're-
thanks.
if
That's-
I've got a huge queue that we're not going to get to, but actually Ann Lipton was at the top of the queue. So Ann, if you've got a got a question, we probably have time for one more question.
Yeah, it was basically, I'm sorry, it's sitting because it was your presentation where you were talking about you weren't sure where passive ownership was contributing, I guess, to hedge fund activism, which I found that surprising because there's a lot of scholarship on passive on hedge funds sort of relying on the passive votes to be able to get their votes across and like to get their, you know, to essentially rely on the passives to vote in favor of them. And in particular, we just saw that the passives are really big on removing takeover protections, which presumably facilitates hedge funds activism. So like, you know, you get rid of the staggered boards, you get that presumably makes it easier for an activist to target the company. So I think they're really, they interact.
I agree with that. And that's an emerging area of research. What I had in mind is that I don't see evidence of them taking the lead in providing the initial contact intervention. So that's what I was referring to. And the part that's the fascinating emerging area is that these the passives could be providing signals. And I think there was this feedback channel, I guess, that Jennifer, you mentioned, that I'm seeing showing up in the literature where the evidence we're getting is about the sequential interaction from one year to the next, as opposed to, we used to look at this as only a one-shot deal, and I don't think it's looking that way anymore.
I'm muted. Now I'm unmuted. I want to thank all the panelists.